Hello, this is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. The JILV opposes the ascendancy of the critical social justice ideology that we're talking about today and supports liberal values inside and outside the Jewish community. I'm very pleased to have with us today Helen Pluckrose, who is the founder of Counterweight, a great organization working in this space. She is also the author of Cynical Theories, and she is a personal mentor of mine. I regard her as one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on these issues, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you, Helen, in great depth about them. So thanks so much for being with us. I just want to give just a bit of context here. Last week, you may have seen that the JILV came out with a white paper on how critical social justice ideology fuels anti-Semitism. And there were several people, some supporters, some critics, who wanted to know more about critical social justice ideology. And I could think of no one else to bring on besides Helen to talk about that. She's written extensively about it. So Helen, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's great to see you.
So I'm going to just go right into it. What is critical social justice anyway?
Okay, so you've got to break this down into two parts. So social justice, the general term that we know, it's the aim for a just society. This is what everybody wants, isn't it? There's nobody really who says, you know what, society needs less justice. So, but the social justice movement has become a particular thing. If we look at the word critical, this is where the confusion generally comes in. So there are, apart from the meaning, to think negatively of something, there are two main meanings of the word critical. There is the term, there's critical thinking and there's critical theory. So in critical thinking, we are looking for truth. We are looking at whether arguments are well reasoned. We're looking at whether there is evidence for truth claims. We're trying to falsify our own beliefs, minimize our own cognitive biases and confirmation biases, and we're looking for truth. With critical thinking, it's a way of looking skeptically at things and trying not to make assumptions. Now, critical theory is something very different. So this has its roots, people have obviously criticized things forever, but critical theory is a look at power. It's specifically not interested in truth. I recommend anybody who wants to see an argument for this to read Alison Bailey's Privilege Preserving Epistemic Pushback paper. So critical theory, it started off with Marxism. Marx said, criticize all the things that exist, but it quickly moved away from Marxism. He focused on economics. It then moved into the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, which looked more broadly at culture. And it sort of moved again into postmodern theories, which have got a very clear focus on power, knowledge, and language. So knowledge is constructed by powerful groups in society. It's what the powerful groups say is true, that society accepts is true. Then this goes into the ways of talking about things, discourses, and is just accepted as true. And these oppressive power systems are perpetuated. So critical in this sense means to look for these power systems and assume that they're there and to try to dig them out. So we get the idea of critical consciousness, which is to have become aware of them. And that maps on very well to the word woke. So when you get critical in this sense, and you get it in critical race theory, critical pedagogy, critical approaches to ableism, you will often find it in conjunction with the term social justice. This is all to do with critical social justice. And these two things, when they come together, it means a way of addressing social justice issues by assuming there to be invisible systems of power and privilege called things like white supremacy, patriarchy, cisnormativity, heteronormativity, ableism, and to assume that they're there and to read everything through them. That is what critical social justice is.
So some people have said recently in response to our paper in particular, but I'm sure it's not the first time they've said it, that critical social justice is a quote unquote made up term by people like you, by people like me, who are looking to sort of to capture unlike things. Where did this term come from? Is it used just by people like us, or is it used by the theorists themselves?
It's used by the theorists themselves. So critical has a longer history. Social justice has been added to it in more recent times. I think I'm going to recommend a book again because it really shows how this has changed, and it's called The Critical Turn in Education, from Marxist critique to post-structuralist feminism to critical theories of race. And you see how it's gone in this direction. So obviously it's a made up term. All terms are made up, but it was made up by the theorists who have produced both the term critical and applied it to all the forms of study which go towards social justice. But you get the clearest explanation of the term in the beginning of the book, Is Everybody Really Equal? Or Is Everyone Really Equal? I think it is, by Özlem Sensoy and Robin DiAngelo. And they begin their book with, what is critical social justice? They explain why they want to use the term critical social justice rather than social justice, because social justice is just the wish for a just society and everybody wants that. They explain that critical social justice uses a particular theoretical model, and it's the one that I spoke about, the idea that we're all socialized by these dominant discourses into white supremacist and patriarchal and ableist and fatphobic views, and that we need to dismantle them by, detoxifying your masculinity and dismantling your whiteness. And that is what critical social justice is. It's a very short introduction. It's a very short it's a very accessible book, and I recommend everyone to read it, mostly because I think it will convince you that critical social justice isn't something that anybody who is liberal would really want to use as their method.
Do you dismiss altogether all of these observations, these theoretical observations they're making about systems of racism and bias being embedded in structures of society?
No, there is a kernel of truth in absolutely everything. It's the approach that there is a problem with. If, we do have biases, they are produced by our culture. It wasn't the postmodernists or the critical theorists or the critical social justice activists that discovered this. We've always known that culture and language are powerful. This is why there's been heresy laws, blasphemy laws, treason laws, what you are and aren't allowed to think and say. So there is that truth. We do need to critically examine it. This is essentially what the Enlightenment and liberalism was about. It's how Europe broke free of the church, of feudalism, of patriarchy. It's how the end of slavery and colonialism came about. So this idea that we have to look critically at systems of power and privilege, and we have to consider that some of them are identity based. There is racism, there is sexism, there is homophobia. These things exist. So that kernel of truth is in there. But then what do we do? Do we theorize very broadly based on these sort of theories of power and privilege, which are quite simplistic, or do we do empirical research, try to falsify our own findings, look into things rigorously with more complexity and nuance? I go for the latter.
So some have suggested that critical social justice, the term, conceptually lumps together very different theories and approaches in order to create sort of an ideological boogeyman. What's your response to that?
It's a look at it. It's all the same approach, but it's applied to different things. So if you're looking in the current critical theories of race, which aren't quite the same thing as critical race theory of the last century, but I'm not going to get into the weeds with that, then you will see this thing where we're all socialized into whiteness, those of us who are white. And then we internalize these ideas as knowledge, we accept them as true, then we perpetuate them with the way we speak about things. Then if you go over into queer theory, you'll find that we're all socialized into heteronormative and cisnormative, which means just assuming that people identify as the sex that's indicated by the reproductive system. And we perpetuate this with the way we talk about things. If you go into fat studies, you find that we're all internalized into having fat phobia, and then we all perpetuate fat phobia by the way we talk about things. So this is the critical social justice approach. It's the same thing applied to different topics. Now, some people use the terms wrongly. They will, so often I will find that some people, particularly on the right, will mistake critical social justice for Marxism, sometimes just because it's easy to lump the two enemies of the right together, but sometimes, most often, perfectly genuinely, because it's easier to understand it as an expansion of Marxist oppressed and oppressor ideas to more broad cultural things. And then there are other people who get confused about liberalism, and they think that that is a form of critical social justice. And this is sometimes, Marxists will often say that critical social justice is a form of extreme liberalism, which it isn't. It's extremely illiberal. Radical feminists have often said that the whole sort of trans activism, queer theory comes from liberal feminism. And so they blame us for it. And conservatives will often call me woke light because I still believe that inequalities exist. I still think we need to address racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and particularly sort of class and economic issues. So I'm apparently woke myself. People will use it wrongly, but it is a consistent set of rules. And again, I would recommend you to say, anyone who is saying to you, this isn't real, look at the first chapter of Sensoy and D'Angelo's book and see the list that they give of what critical theory, what critical social justice is, what it means, and what people who believe in it will do.
Yeah, so Eugene Greenstein asks, how does this relate to critical race theory? And I think you've answered that, but perhaps reinforce that, because I think people are still confused about some of this terminology and how they connect.
So critical race theory emerged in the 1970s, and it was in legal studies, and it used a lot of the ideas that we see now, but it was more specifically legal. It was more complicated. It had a lot of legalistic language, which is why it's actually clearer and easier to read than most of the theories of the end of the last century. As this has evolved, what we're looking at now, I would call critical social justice theories of race. It draws on those same ideas, particularly. I'm going to go back a tiny bit. I don't want to get us too lost in the weeds, but there were two main branches of critical race theory. There were the materialists, who were much more sort of oppressed and oppressor. They saw a very simplistic divide. From this generation, we get the Black nationalists and that kind of thinking. And then there was the postmodern branch, and they were looking at things being socially constructed, the systems of power that cluster around certain groups, white people and men. And this is what has evolved, but it's simplified and it's moved into cultural studies. So critical social justice approaches to racism and anti-racism are a direct descendant of the postmodern branch of critical race theory, but simplified. Essentially, that would be the short answer.
Okay, great. So there are a few other questions that we'll come back to, but I want to ask you about the difference between what we're calling critical social justice and what you've termed liberal social justice. How would you distinguish those two?
Okay, so liberalism is something that is criticized throughout critical social justice, most explicitly in critical race theory. The critical race theorists tend to put out tenets and lists of things, and one of their core ones is critique of liberalism. And what they mean by that is that they are critiquing the idea of the individual, of the universal, of meritocracy, of colorblindness, of treating people the same. So they are critical of what we would generally consider liberalism. And perhaps I should clarify, because I know that many people listening will be American, and quite often Americans use liberal to mean leftist, whereas here in the UK it often is understood to mean centrist, and in Australia it's understood to mean conservative. But when I'm talking about liberalism, I'm talking about sort of 5 factors. First of all, we have the respect for reason and the respect for science. So we have rationalism and empiricism. That's the epistemological, the knowledge-based aspects of liberalism. Then when we get into the ethical parts of liberalism, we have individualism. This is the idea that everybody should be treated as an individual. They shouldn't be constrained by the properties of their group. I shouldn't be put into any role because I am a woman. Nobody should make any assumption about you because you're Jewish. So this is where individualism comes in, and liberalism wants to remove any barrier that prevents any individual from achieving everything that society has to offer, which is the universalism. And that's the idea that we are all have a shared common humanity, and we all should have the same rights and the same responsibilities, and the same rules should apply to all of us. Now, in the middle of that is pluralism, which is a little bit more complicated, because this is the idea that people can have different ideas and still live together quite harmoniously, and maybe even be friends. So in this polarized, politically polarized sort of situation that we are in at the moment, perhaps it's better to give an example with religion. So if we were to take, for example, atheists, Christians, Jews, and Muslims, they all have a different belief about the nature of Christ. Who was he? What is his significance? Not one of them has to oppress and silence any of the others. They don't have to agree with each other either. They just have to accept each other's right to believe something different. And that's part of a liberal society, this pluralistic idea that, I don't have to agree with you, but we can live together. It's different from relativism, which is when people will say, well, you're all right, which obviously isn't possible.
Right. One person posted in the comment section, liberalism is the ideology of the Economist magazine. And I did note that the Economist came out with a article defending liberalism recently, but I'm wondering if that's really captures it. It seems to me that the Economist may favor sort of a left of center approach, but also fundamentally be liberal in nature. But there are also, correct me if I'm wrong, Helen, right of center liberals as well, classical liberals as well, who would equally be classified as such.
Yes, I mean, we see liberalism doesn't belong to the left or the right. We see, I think the best way to understand liberalism is to understand it as the opposite of illiberalism. So we all recognize totalitarianism, authoritarianism, intolerance when we see it. So there are factions on the right who are intolerant and who are authoritarian, and there are factions on the left who are. The people who aren't, the people who are saying, treat everyone as an individual, give everybody the same rights, accept differences without trying to eradicate them, they are the liberals. And you will find them on the right and the left. So I'm a liberal leftist. So I lean towards leftist economic policies while having liberal beliefs about society and culture. A classical liberal who sort of verges on a libertarian might be right-wing economically, but they will still support things like same-sex marriage, usually the gender equality, racial equality. So they are still liberals.
So one question is, do you think critical social justice is best understood as a top-down phenomenon or as a bottom-up phenomenon, wokeness that should be lowercase? I'm not exactly sure what they mean by lowercase, but how would you regard this phenomenon? I'll expand. He asked another question, so that might actually go. Should we understand the modern woke movement driven by semi-obscure legal scholars or by trends in social media?
All of the above. I recommend, again, some more book recommendations, but I recommend, if you're going to read Cynical Theories, you'll get the theoretical aspect of it, how it developed in the scholarship. The best psychological look at how it developed in culture is The Coddling of the American Mind by Lukianoff and Haidt. And the best sociological look at how culture has changed is The Rise of Victimhood Culture by Manning and Campbell. So these three books together, I think, are really sort of show how a number of factors have come together. Because sometimes people have criticized me because I've written about the development of the scholarship. They assume that I'm saying, well, this came from the universities and then it just spread out and they're completely responsible. No, there have been things happening in society as well that has made it susceptible to these ideas. As the ideas in the university have become more accessible, more simpler, more user friendly, you can grasp them. They're much less sophisticated and complicated than they seem. You can just lay them down over society, and it's much easier than thinking about things with complexity and nuance. And at the same time, society has changed in ways in which younger people, as Haidt and Lukianoff argue, have started to expect a kind of emotional safety, which ties in with the idea of language as being so dangerous. We've seen a lot of the change with social media, when people can form mobs and collectives without being anywhere near each other. This has had a big influence on it. So I wouldn't like, and I don't think any one individual is actually able to bring together all of the threads that have caused this moment, but there are many of them. I'm halfway through Vivek Ramaswamy's Woke Inc. at the moment, which I'm finding very interesting for explaining how it ties in with capitalism and corporate culture, which is not something that I have much expertise in, and it makes perfect sense to me with what I'm seeing and what I know.
So Liang Feng Chao, who is a leader on these in California on these issues of education and the like, says, so liberalism generally supports LGBTQ rights due to pluralism, she asks?
Due to universalism, the LGBT rights. So the idea, whereas the critical social justice activists and the Marxists are revolutionary, they want to turn society upside down. The liberals are reformists. They think society is already quite good, but all of its rights haven't been extended to everybody. So when you see something like the legalization of same-sex marriage, that's not a revolution, that's a reform. We didn't used to allow couples of the same sex to get married. That was illiberal. We changed that. We included them. And, and prior to that, we included women and working class men in voting. We allowed racial minorities and Jews and sort of working class people into universities, professions, women into professions. So this is the liberal thing, opening up liberal society to more and more people. That's the universalism.
Zachary Narrett asks, doesn't critical social justice have a prominent coercive component that is extremely troubling?
It does, because people really believe that they have found the truth. If it was true, I mean, this is what I think is the best thought experiment. If it really was true that there were dominant discourses in society, and that you couldn't help but be socialized into them, and that they were oppressing people, it would be really, really important to stop people saying those things that hurt other people. Now, the liberal point of view would differ from this. We'd say, yes, language is important, but there are many discourses in society, and we need them to go up against each other so we can compare them and evaluate them and get the best ideas from these. I mean, I would say that critical social justice is a dominant discourse in itself at the moment. We can see that it has power. We can see that it's harming people. But we also see we're having this conversation. We're seeing people pushing back. We're seeing liberals pushing back. We're seeing people who are more conservative on the other side of liberal pushing back, and we're seeing people pushing back for less liberal reasons as well. But there are a lot of discourses in society. So yes, there is an inherently coercive element to anybody who thinks that they have found the truth and the way to make society just as there is for anybody who thinks they know the one way to get to heaven or something like that. It's the true believers are the dangerous people.
So speaking of a variety of these discourses, in some sense, isn't your critique or our critique of this dominant discourse of critical social justice in itself using the tools of critical theory to analyze a discourse? And aren't we doing the same thing that we accuse the critical social justice folks of doing by criticizing a discourse and claiming that it has primacy?
This is what we wrote in Cynical Theories, and we've argued before. We are deconstructing dominant narratives. We are challenging the meta narrative that is critical social justice. But whereas the postmodernists thought that they often act as though they think they discovered this idea. In fact, they didn't. We have been challenging dominant discourses for some considerable time. So before postmodernism arose, I mean, it really got dominant in about the 80s, and that was after the civil rights movements, the decriminalization of homosexuality, the Equality Act, where women and racial minorities are no longer allowed to be discriminated against. So we've been challenging those dominant narratives for forever. And we've done it at increasing speed in the liberal period, which has developed gradually over the modern period. So yes, we're doing the same thing in that we are challenging oppressive power structures, but the critical social justice people don't own that. There are different ways to do this, and I'm arguing for the liberal way to do it.
So this may be outside your comfort zone. You'll let us know. But Trisha asked, how and why does this all seem to target Jews? And as you know, we just came out with our report. Do you want to comment on that at all?
This isn't my area of expertise at all, but that what I'm seeing at the moment is that Jews are within critical social justice theory. There are two main reasons why Jews are particularly targeted. It is because they are commonly assumed to be white, which of course a lot of Jews aren't. But a lot of Western Jews are white, and they are one of the wealthiest and most successful groups. So this is considered to be a social privilege. And therefore there must be some kind of oppressive power structure in there. Then there is also the post-colonial guilt issue, where the UK and America and a lot of other countries have this guilt about having, UK, we colonized a third of the world, and this was a lot of places where Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs lived. There is now this sense, there is a great fear of Islamophobia and a wish to undo Islamophobia because of the Palestine and Israel issue. And the polarization, there is this idea that in order to not be Islamophobic, you have to be anti-Israel, and this easily leads into being anti-Semitic for some people. Those are the two reasons I'm seeing.
Right. By the way, that's a dimension that we actually did not explore fully in our white paper. So perhaps that will lead to further analysis of this issue. Trisha, I hope you'll take a look. It's on the jilv.org website, the white paper on critical social justice and anti-Semitism, which does go into some depth on that. But Helen's just added a new dimension to it. So Helen, we have this phenomena that you've talked about. What can be done to counter the imposition of critical social justice? And what is Counterweight, your organization that has been really come onto the scene in the last year? What is it doing to help reverse this tide?
I think generally the first and most important thing that needs to be done in order to counter critical social justice is to understand it. And it isn't as complicated as it seems. You can read a small number of books, articles, get your head around the basic framework, which really is as simple as those three concepts of knowledge, power, and language that I mentioned, with some frills and furnishings around them. So our handbook is coming out. I'm not going to promote my own book, but it's going to break those down more. So understand it, first of all, then respond to it with both knowledge and principle. So the reason that it is often difficult to argue with critical social justice is because people think if you are doing so, your motivation must be because you don't want to see progress on racial equality, on gender equality, the greater acceptance of trans people, and into homophobia. And so that's why it is so important to say, no, I agree with your aims to have we want a post-racial society. We don't believe we already have one. This is a criticism often made of liberals, that we're accused of wanting to maintain the status quo. No, we don't believe that we have already achieved a perfectly liberal society. This is an ongoing project forever. So being principled, saying that you have these same aims for social justice, but you don't think these methods are going to work. You think we need rigorous scholarship. You think we need consistent ethics where the same rules apply to the same people. We consistently don't evaluate people by their race, for example. This is the way to address it on the level of ideas. So at Counterweight, we have four main prongs, in which we provide educational resources which are accessible, and we offer practical support and strategizing. We help people write letters. We have template letters, and we practice with them if they're going to have a meeting at work, if they want to challenge a policy or training program. We have our listening service, because one problem that goes severely underestimated is the amount of stress and strain that operating and working within a CSJ dominated environment puts on people. And you would be surprised the number of people who come to us who aren't white. Actually, in the last month, it was just over half of the people who came to us worrying about anti-racist training were either Black or South Asian. So this is something that we do. We offer them a one-on-one listening session. There's drop-in sessions, there's group sessions where people can, feel that they can let out their frustrations. And we have a community. So we bring people together and they find other people in their own profession or their own area, and they start to feel stronger and they start to organize. That's what Counterweight does. And we refer, if people need legal advice or more specialized advice, we have a lot of sort of partner organizations. I just referred someone to the Jewish Institute of Liberal Values today.
Oh, wonderful. We look forward to hearing from them. Hopefully they're on today. By the way, before I started the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, I got my crash course at Counterweight, and I've been fortunate to be on the Counterweight team and to learn from Helen and other activists in this sphere. And we've learned a lot on how to define these issues, and we're really grateful for that. Before we go, I want to ask you one question from Ilana, because I think it's a really important one. Is there an elevator pitch for what critical social justice is? Like, if you had to sort of boil it down into a couple sentences, how would you do so?
Okay, one of our patrons has asked me this, and I'm going to write a guide to explaining it. But in a couple of sentences, critical social justice is the belief that we are all socialized into believing certain narratives. These narratives have been set up to benefit the privileged in society. We accept them unconsciously. This is why we need unconscious bias training, and why we are not woke, and we need to and these kind of discourses need to be disrupted, so we need to take everything apart. So it's those three things. It's the knowledge, power, and language. The power produces the knowledge, which then goes into language, which perpetuates the oppressive power structures. That is what underlies all of the theories, although they've diversified into many branches and cast-offs, but that's the underlying body of it.
Thank you very much for that. Well, Helen, thank you so much for all that you do to help defend liberalism in society, for being really one of the philosophical voices behind this movement. We will come to you, if it's okay, we'll come back to you again to help advise us and help us think through some of the challenges that we face.
Yes, absolutely, and I expect to be calling on you as well.
Please do so. Thank you to all the viewers. Gamar Chatima Tova. May this be a wonderful year. May you be sealed in the book of life. And we will look forward to continuing these important conversations. We have one next week. I think it's on, if I'm correct, September 14th. It's an open discussion. I believe it might be at 12 noon Eastern time. So don't take my word for it. Check out the website, where we're going to be talking in an open way with all of you about critical social justice and anti-Semitism, and getting your thoughts on that. So we look forward to that. Thanks again, Helen. Thank you all for being with us. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. That was great.